All right, everyone, welcome to asynchronous class this week. We are studying attachment. So first off, I want you to think of a distressing memory from your early childhood, all right? What emotions were you experiencing? Did any of your caregivers, perhaps a parent, help you navigate that situation? And how did you feel towards that caregiver at the time? Pause the video and think about that. So this activity is getting at attachment. Did you have someone in your life who was your secure base for attachment? So today I'm going to go over some brief class information, then we're going to define attachment, talk about the perspectives on early relationships. One thing you'll notice in this lecture is that a lot of attachment is based on theory. Then we'll go into the development of attachment security, the famous strange situation experiment, and then we'll go into the roles of maternal employment and culture in attachment. First, let's talk about class. Y'all have an exam next week, your first one. This exam will cover the introductory stuff in our first lecture. We'll cover temperament, and it will cover this lecture, attachment. An important thing to know is that the exams across this class are not cumulative. So the next exam will not test you on these factors. When you look at the exam, you'll have a 72-hour period in which you can take that exam from 3 p.m. Wednesday next week to 2:59 p.m. on Saturday. The exam takes you have 2 hours to take the exam once you start it. And you can only take it one time. You can't go back to it. So make sure when you go to take the exam that you're set up to take the full thing. The exam itself is 25 multiple choice questions. You'll have 4 options for each question. We're going to provide you with 10 STEM questions on Thursday at 5 p.m. All right, so that's this Thursday. So Thursday at 5 p.m. you'll be provided with those 10 STEM questions. Those exact questions will be on your exam. So use them as a study guide and a reference for what kind of questions you can expect to get. We have office hours next week, so feel free to use our Calendly pages to set up appointments and ask questions if you can. We love to help out, so feel free to look at those. All right, very quickly, I wanted to note that the optional paper is something to begin thinking about. For undergraduates and graduate students, you can earn up to 5% extra credit points doing an optional paper. The optional paper is 7 pages, all right? And you can choose a movie or a subject of interest. So either you choose the movie option, which is option 2, or the subject of interest, and you look at it compared to 2 class subjects. A class subject is like temperament or attachment. The goal of this paper is to have you dive deeper on 2 subjects. So the important thing to know is that you don't want to do 5 class subjects related to this area of interest or movie. The proposal, it's a 1/2 page maximum proposal of what these ideas are going to be, is due in November. So you have plenty of time before you actually have to submit that. I find it helpful to think about which subjects you're most interested in though while we go through lectures. So think about what stands out to you the most as something you want to look into across the class. Let's get into defining attachment. So attachment is defined as a strong disposition to seek proximity to and contact with a specific figure, and to do so in certain situations, notably when frightened or tired or ill. So this is a child's instinct to seek a safe figure in their life, specifically in situations where you're nervous or afraid or excited. This person serves as a secure base for you. So in that intro example, we're talking about a situation where you were experiencing distress in some way. Did you seek out a caregiver who could help you manage that situation? If you think about it, it's very, very adaptive for us as young children to say, I need a support system, and attach that to a figure. So let's talk about the attachment system. This is generally a control system that motivates an infant to seek proximity to an individual. This is both psychological proximity and this is physical proximity. They want to be close to this person. It's this instinct for children to be close to their caregiver. All right. There's also an internal goal of felt security. The child wants to feel that security based on this individual. That's what they associate with safety, is that person. All right. Especially the attachment system is activated when kids feel distressed. Typically, our first memories have to do with fear, some type of strong emotion in general, but usually it's almost always fear. And oftentimes people's first memories also have to do with an interaction with the caregiver alleviating that distress. So if you did choose your earliest memory for the distressing event, that might have been what you saw. And this is one of multiple systems that children use when they're young. That's what attachment is. The system itself is a product of natural selection and tends to be talked about as universal in humans. We're going to test that and look at that more. First, we want to talk about the universality hypothesis. This hypothesis is that when given an opportunity, infants become attached to one or more specific caregivers. All right, so everyone is attached to a caregiver, but the quality of these relationships differ. All right, this is in comparison to the normative hypothesis, which says most infants are going to be securely attached. A secure attachment is where they are securely attached to a caregiver. So all humans have some sort of attachment, but whether or not this is a secure relationship differs. And most relationships we will see will be secure. And we also want to consider the quality of the attachment. These are individual differences in organization of physiological, representational, and behavioral processes used to maintain the effective security set point and develops as a function interactions with the attachment. Essentially, this is talking about individual differences determining an attachment relationship and how that relationships develop. So the reactions of a child will dictate what that attachment relationship looks like. And the individual differences in the caregiver might determine what that attachment relationship looks like and develops over time. Attachment is the culmination of multiple caregiver-child interactions across time. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the development of attachment relationships. So this leads to the antecedent hypothesis that basically says when predictors of attachment security highlight the importance of interpersonal processes and the environment. So again, this is specific to the individual child, the individual parent. In other words, all right, let's get to the perspectives on early relationships. And keep in mind, this is gonna get real theory heavy. Sigmund Freud, creepiest guy. I'll give you a moment to pause the video and look at this quote. All right, so as with everything else he theorized, Freud believed that the mother-infant bond is founded in and predicts your sex life. Breastfeeding, he said, is the first sexual instinct that an infant will experience and lays the groundwork for what your sexual life is going to look like in the future. So we know that attachment forms the base for many of our social relationships, but Freud was really only focusing on one aspect of those relationships. Not all relationships are sexual, and our sexuality may not just derive from this theory. Other perspectives like Claus and Kennel talked about how the mother-infant bond is the foundation for all subsequent attachments and your personal identity. So take a moment to pause the video and read through this quote. What they're saying is your attachment influences the quality of your relationships as a child, adolescent, now as a grad student, and in the future. A secure relationship with a caregiver, someone like a parent, will probably be related to having secure relationships now. They mean secure in terms of the stability of the relationship. Do you trust this person? Can you rely on this person? Do they represent a part of your support system? And then we have another perspective that talks about about society and attachment. So the argument of this is that an individual becomes a toxic or a non-toxic member of society based on the experiences they have with their parents in those first 3 years of life. No pressure for new parents, right? You get an infant. By the way, these first 3 years matter more than anything. After that, you can go home. It's fine. One thing I want you to keep in mind though, how have the relationships you've had from 4 years old to now impacted you? Do you think the relationships in school you have with your teachers matter? Are the relationships you have on teams with your coaches and teammates important for your development? I know as a basketball player, having those relationships with the coaches was very motivating for me. Do you think these relationships help you become, quote unquote, a better member of society? It's interesting to focus on attachment as a function of society. The contrary argument to this idea was this book titled The Myth of the First 3 Years. So we know that the first 5 years in general of development, but particularly the first 3 years, are important. But the argument in this book by Brewer is that the later development matters significantly as well. This book specifically focuses on intelligence and being a successful thinker. But you can apply it to other things like being a lifelong learner and how the role of being a lifelong learner is a protective factor against Alzheimer's and other diseases in older adulthood. So you can see there are a lot of different perspectives on what attachment is and what these early relationships mean for child development. But generally, what all of these ideas concluded was that strong caregiver relations are essential in healthy development. And what they found was that a lot of these relationships are shaped by parental or caregiver sensitivity. Sensitivity referring to, did your mom respond to your needs? Did you have one person you could count on to be secure or safe in your life? Did they show you warmth and affection? An example of this was a few years ago, I was hanging out with some friends and their 3-year-old son was playing and he happened to fall over and bump a cabinet on the head. And he was distressed. He started crying, it hurt. I believe he developed a bruise later. This 3-year-old stood up, screaming, crying, and immediately looked around for his mom. He didn't care who else was there. He didn't care that other people were there to help him. He was looking for his mother. And he found her, and his mom calmed him down, said, "I'm so sorry." She held him in his arms, so you get that physical closeness. You get that emotional response where he can cry and she can comfort him. And so this is an example of a child experiencing some distressing event, and then the mother responding and being sensitive to that child's need. This developed into the sensitivity hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that attachment security is dependent on child rearing antecedents, particularly sensitive and prompt responses to an infant and their attachment signals. So responding to a child when they are distressed. So let's talk a little bit more about maternal sensitivity. In the historical perspective, a lot of people thought too much sensitivity is actually a bad thing. You can mess up your children if you're too sensitive to them. So being too responsive to their needs. If you overwhelm your children with being overly sensitive to everything they need, you'll mess them up. And this led to some interesting perspectives that I completely disagree with, including this dude Watson. All right, so you should pause the video and read through this quote. So Watson's whole perspective was, don't respond to your children. They're fine on their own. You want to push them to be independent for as much as possible throughout their childhood. Pat them on the head when they do well. Kiss them on the forehead, but only on big occasions. No physical affection or emotional support should come from the parents. I mean, imagine being a parent and telling an infant that's crying, "You're fine, take care of yourself. You're good," right? A little bit later, we'll examine current views of maternal sensitivity. But this was one perspective saying, no, don't be sensitive to kids' needs. It gives them too much. All right. So what do we know so far? In general, from these historical perspectives, we know that strong caregiver relations are really essential for healthy development. We also know that people said, maybe too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And people also claimed parents have to foster this independence in children without giving them a lot of affection. You always want to push them towards that independence. all of these perspectives didn't really hit the nail on the head of what attachment is, and all of them were very narrow in their own lanes. To summarize it all and bring it together, in the historical perspectives, we didn't really have a strong sense of the importance of the mother-child bond at that point. So bringing all these together, in general, there really was a societal need to understand the importance of that mother-child attachment relationship and these early relationships. One of the big factors in our world was World War II. Men went to war and women took up jobs and worked. When the men actually returned home, women lost their jobs. During the war, other people were taking care of their children, but now there was a cultural push to encourage women to stay home because they wanted to provide those jobs to the men who had come back from the war. There's actually some really fascinating work from the 1950s on the ways they tried to convince women to stay home. A lot of it boils down to advertising things like cleaning products and targeting those towards women. There are also things like children being raised in orphanages or institutions. We have kids who don't have parents. Perhaps they're adopted, perhaps we have kids in foster care systems, but does your primary caregiver have to be the mother or the father? Aren't there other people that can play a role in these relationships? Most of the attachment literature has focused on the mother-child relationship for political and research reasons, but other people play a role in your life. Can you be attached even to your siblings? Do they play a role in your life? Generally, Bowlby is the researcher you read this week. He took all these old frameworks that didn't really work. So he developed his own theory, all right, and developed this big piece that you read. It's a dry, I know, it is the basis of attachment research, so it's really important to read, but it is very dry. So good job getting through that. But a lot of the work and theory we're going to talk about is Bowlby's work. Bowlby believed that attachment was as important for mental health as vitamins and proteins are for physical health. He talked about attachment as this critical piece of children's development. And he developed the maternal deprivation hypothesis that talked about, centered around if you separate a mother and child, again, for scientific and political reasons, but that separating children from their mothers could be detrimental. And it looked at that as almost a mental health protective factor. So Bowlby developed this ethological perspective on attachment. So in general, the mother-child bond is a product of evolution. You bond with your caregiver because they care for you. And the children who are closely bonded with their caregiver are the most likely to survive. If you're more closely bonded with a caregiver, perhaps they protect you better or work harder to gain you resources. So Bowlby theorized that this was a product of evolution. And we're going to look at this with ethology, which is studying animals to understand humans' behavior from a biological perspective. So people said, hey, can we study attachment in animals to better understand attachment in children? So for instance, this guy to the right is a psychologist who had ducks imprint on him when they were born, and they followed him around and formed very strong attachment bonds with him. And he used that to talk about the attachment relationship. All right, we're going to spend some time on Harlow's monkeys, and here are some adorable pictures of the attachment relationship. This led Caspi to the theory of secondary drive. The theory of secondary drive states that we like to be with other people primarily because they feed us. So our primary drive is hunger and food. Baby's hungry, baby needs food. The secondary drive in this theory are relationships with the individuals who feed us. So we form relationships with people because they feed us. There's some interesting evidence for that. We get certain reactions when we are full. When you're really, really hungry and then you eat a lot of food, then you get positive reactions. And the theory would be you associate those positive reactions with the caregiver and form a deeper relationship with them. right? So I always think of Thanksgiving and sometimes my husband will skip all the food earlier in the day and then just eat all of Thanksgiving meal so he can really enjoy that meal. So he goes from very hungry to very relaxed in that. So think of when you visit home though. Do you think of food first or do you think of the people who are at home? What means home to you? So is this relationship just about sustenance? Is it really that children just say, you feed me, therefore you can be friends or be close with me? Or is there something else going on here? Another example of this is my dog Cooper. So there's a picture of him. He is my parents' dog, so he's back in Oregon, and I absolutely adore him. He's a miniature Australian Shepherd, very cute dog. Now, my dad feeds Cooper every single day, and my dad is by far his favorite person. So it supports this idea, perhaps because my dad feeds Cooper, he's closest with him. But my dad is also the person who walks Cooper and plays with him the most. He tends to be around him the most. Cooper sleeps on next to my dad's side of the bed. So he also has this deep relationship in other ways. Could playing with your dog also make them form a greater attachment with you? Or could walking your dog form that greater attachment? So Harlow is the person who tested the secondary drive hypothesis. And this is an experiment that would never be done today because it seems unethical to me personally, but not as much IRB back then. And it's a little sad, but he took infant monkeys the second they were born and removed them from their mothers and put them in a cage. And he essentially provided a wire feeding monkey mother and a comfortable mother, a mother with a blanket on it, which is pictured here, and let the babies hang out with those mothers. So what you're seeing here is the primary drive. He created mother one with a primary drive of feeding them. And then he created a secondary drive mother who was comfortable for the baby to be around. So pause this video and go watch the YouTube clip of Harlow's monkeys. This is on our course website, and it's also on YouTube under that link. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It's really sad, actually. So it's hard for me to watch the babies be alone. But the conclusions from this study were that the infants do not become more responsive to the wire mother. It's not just about food. In fact, they form way stronger relationships with the comfort mother, spending 18 hours a day snuggling with the comfort cloth mother. So it sort of debunked this idea of the secondary drive, that we're just driven, our relationships are only formed because of food. There's also something else going on here. So it likely goes back to that idea of mother sensitivity. Your caregiver responds to your needs of feeding. So perhaps it's not about getting fed, it's about the fact that your mother or caregiver responds to you. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The bottom of the hierarchy of needs is basic needs, like shelter, food, security, right? Perhaps in attachment, it's that your caregiver provides those things for you, not those things themselves. So it really boils down to that relationship between your caregiver responding to you and maternal sensitivity. So to summarize everything together, historical perspectives on attachment tend to focus on the mother-infant bond and maternal sensitivity. They really believed these concepts laid the foundation for our future relationships. Bowlby brought together that old theory that wasn't totally working and developed it into our current perspective. That perhaps he said the mother-infant bond is key, perhaps secondary drive is important, but that was debunked by Harlow. So there's a lot of theory going on here, and we're still trying to learn really what is going on with these attachment relationships. They provided a base for our understanding. But let's go forward and look at how we develop this attachment security. So how does attachment develop? Well, from birth to about 2 months, we experience the pre-attachment phase, which is marked by an orientation or limited discrimination. Our vision is actually fuzzy for the first few weeks we're alive. You recognize voices, but it takes a while, about a month, for that vision to really come into focus. If someone's close to you, you can see them relatively well. But we also know that we're hardwired for social interactions from day one. Babies love looking at faces, even if they are a little blurry, especially expressive faces. This can be seen in that famous experiment when the psychologist asked his wife in the first 10 minutes of our child being born, can I make faces and see if he mimics me? The idea here was, can I have a social interaction with a baby that's a newborn, like 10 minutes old? And there are pictures of the baby mimicking his dad's facial expression in that case. So babies are hardwired to socially interact from a young age. They love looking at faces. And those are lay the groundwork for that attachment relationship. So here's some examples of some evidence on that early pre-attachment phase. Like I said, social mimicry. You see babies mimicking their father's facial expression. You also see distress expressions, like in this baby here, and a bias towards synchrony. So they did a study where they watched the interactions between a mother and a child while the baby is breastfeeding. And what they found was that a baby would suck during breastfeeding for a little while, and then they would start pausing. When they paused, the mother would jiggle them during the feeding, and then they would start sucking again. And you see this go back and forth. So even as something as simple as breastfeeding, there's actually an interaction happening, and the mother and child are synchronizing with each other to create a feeding experience. So you see the infant responding to the caregiver here. There's also evidence of pre-attachment in the caregiver themselves. A huge influx of hormones leads to caregiver behavior. New mothers often talk about love holding their baby, and they feel such a strong connection with their child, and they love looking at an infant's face. And they can distinguish between the different cries of their child. So there's evidence that hormones make caregivers feel more attached to infants as well. So this is also the baseline for what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks after your exam, which is emotion regulation. You see here that the baby is doing something and the mother and then stops and the mother responds. Or a baby might start crying and the mother responds. So you see at the beginning of emotion regulation where the caregiver is starting to help the baby regulate their emotions. From about 2 months to 6 to 9 month age, we start seeing attachment really being formed. All right, so during this time, we see orientation and evident discrimination. So at this point, babies like being oriented towards you. They like being held certain ways. They usually like facing you and seeing your face. About 2 months is when babies can actually recognize people. This is a joyous time because the emergence of the social smile. So babies recognize at this age when they want to express joy or happiness that they smile. Or if they're in a social situation, they realize this is when you can smile. And it's adorable because before, babies don't do that as a reactionary or imitation piece. But then at this point, they actually do it in social interactions. And this is a time when children start to engage in social behavior and attention and language engagement. If you guys saw that video that went viral a couple months ago of this dad sitting on the couch watching TV with his really young son, it is the funniest video in the world because this dad is talking to the child and the baby is talking complete gibberish back to him. It's an adorable video, and I think the dad and child ended up going on a talk show because this video went so viral. But babies want to talk to you. They want to engage with you, even though they can't talk at all. They begin initiating those social interactions. This is also when attachment behaviors begin to become organized. All right, this is when patterns start to emerge. We see the beginning of consistent reactions by babies to evoke a response in a caregiver. So for instance, a child may say, when I fall down, I know that I need to cry loudly, and then my mother will respond to me, or caregiver will respond to me in this way. Or I know that when I'm happy, I should smile, and my mother or caregiver will respond to me in this way. And then this is a time when we start seeing the predictors of attachment behavior become more systematic. So attachment figures at this age might be able to start being able to tell how their baby is going to react to something. For instance, if a stranger comes in the room, and caregiver may know, oh, this is how my child is going to react. It becomes a system. It's essentially building a relationship, building consistent patterns of behavior between a caregiver and a child. Yes, and as I said, they begin to initiate social interaction during that time. All right, and then we get to attachment in all its glory. This is the golden age of attachment, you might say, about that 6 to 9 month period to 3 years. This is when we deal with things like, this is when most of the research on attachment tends to focus on. All right, so we see orientation towards the specific caregiver in the attachment relationship. Babies discriminate between people they are attached to and people they aren't, their primary caregivers. They seek proximity to that caregiver. A lot of times you'll see children at parks, particularly 3-year-olds, they'll run and play and then they'll come back to mom, and then they'll run and play and come back to mom. Mom is home base, which is that safe base piece. They seek physical and psychological proximity to their mother. This is also a period where infants will seek out their caregivers for social interaction, for safety, for their basic needs, and the attachment behaviors become specific to that caregiver. When you were a child, you might have had specific games you played with one caregiver, and then other games you played with a different caregiver. Perhaps there is one, if you were distressed, you would go to more than another caregiver. Having this secure base or this safe person helps children explore the world. They're not able to be fully responsible for themselves, so they rely on this person to be their secure base so they can explore the world. This is also when you see kids have things like separation distress and stranger anxiety. When I've met a lot of children around 7 to 8 months old, they get really nervous around strangers, and they get really worried about being separated from their parent. They're scared of strangers at this point. This is the attachment relationship. We'll talk more about these two, especially in the strange situation experiment. So let's move on to the strange situation. Ainsworth was a student of Bowlby's who took his concepts with attachment and decided to figure out a way to measure this. And she started with a few key concepts. We've discussed the secure base, the physical and psychological proximity to an attachment figure that promotes safety. As I said, kids will play on the playground and return to their parent figure. Sometimes they do this even to check that the parent is there, just to say hi and check in, and then they'll go back. This person is a secure base from which to explore the world. Another concept is that a parent or caregiver as a safe haven. Children will internalize attachment figures as a physical and emotional comfort they can return to alleviate stress. So for instance, that story of the young child who returned to his mother when he bonked his head. For me, my earliest memory I have is getting caught in a snowdrift in Oregon. Doesn't snow very often in Oregon. In this memory, I was younger than 3, and I happened to walk into a big pile of snow because we had a quote unquote snowstorm, which in Oregon means that it snowed a foot. And I walked into a snowdrift and couldn't get out and started crying. My dad was right next to me, so I cried and screamed for my dad, and he picked me up and put me on his shoulders. In this instance, I was experiencing stress because I didn't know how to get out of the snowdrift, and my dad acted as a safe haven by just picking me up and putting me on his shoulders. The last piece of her theory was the internal working model. It has to do with the history of how caregivers have responded to needs, and that affects the child's representation of that caregiver. So what that means is you have a parent or a caregiver who responds to your needs. How they respond impacts how you represent them. So in the case of me as a small child, my dad had consistently responded to my needs before when I'd been in distressful situations. So when I cried in the snowdrift, I knew in my head I was representing my father as a safe person. And I have this representation of dad will fix it. Dad is a safe person to help me with this. So the internal working model is a child's representation of a caregiver based on how they've responded to you in the past. So the question here is, we've talked about attachment security, how it develops. Ainsworth wanted to answer, how do you measure attachment other than a questionnaire? So she developed an experiment. It took about 4 years, and then she tested this originally with Ugandan children. In this experiment, first, an experimenter introduces a parent or baby to a playroom and then leaves. The playroom often has toys for the child to play with. In this situation, the parent usually then sits with the child while the baby plays. So this is an example of a parent as a secure base. In the study, they look at, is the baby comfortable leaving the parent to play, which would indicate that they see the parent as a secure base that they can move out from. Next, a stranger enters the room, sits down, and talks with the parent. Here, they look at how the baby responds to the presence of the stranger. Do they go back to the parent because they're anxious at the introduction of the stranger? Do they just keep playing and ignore the stranger? After this, it's very sad usually because the baby starts crying, but the parent leaves and the stranger offers the baby comfort if the baby is upset. So they look at a couple different factors here. Do they look at A, is the baby upset by the parent leaving? B, does the baby respond to the stranger offering them comfort? And this is a measure of separation anxiety. The next step is that the parent returns, greets the baby, and offers comfort to often the distressed baby. And the stranger leaves during this time. So they call this reunion behavior. Does the baby let the parent comfort them? Do they not? And then again, the parent leaves the room for a second time, and they look at, is the baby upset by the parent leaving? Do they experience separation anxiety? In this case, the stranger enters the room and offers comfort to the baby. So can the baby be soothed by a stranger? And then finally, the parent returns again, greets the baby and offers comfort, and tries to interest the baby in toys. Again, they're looking at reunion behavior. Oftentimes when the parent returns and offers comfort, they're curious, will the baby totally recover and be able to play again, or will they remain in distress? So again, go to the course website or to YouTube and look up the estranged situation. This video shows you the whole experiment in its entirety. So take a couple minutes and review that. All right, I always find it hard in that video to see the children so distressed and see them suffering so much in that case. And it's interesting to see what that behavior looks like. So from this study, Ainsworth sorted children into a couple different attachment categories. They looked at how kids responded in this experiment to say, how attached are they to this caregiver? First is group B, which are the securely attached babies. In the pre-separation phase, when the baby is playing with the mother in the room, they tend to use their mothers as a secure base from which to explore. Oftentimes, this is when the children start playing with toys, when they start exploring the room, but they look back and see if their mother is there. In the separation phase, when the mother leaves the room, the attachment behavior is greatly intensified. Kids don't want to explore as much. They're usually stressed, crying, sad, and calling for that attachment character to come back. They're not interested in the toys anymore. The more important thing is where their caregiver has gone. The important thing is in the reunion phase, they seek contact with, proximity to, and interaction with their mother. At this point in the reunion, the baby will say, "I'm not okay, you left, please comfort me." So securely attached babies, even though their mother left, will still look to their mothers to provide that secure base in a reunion episode. And oftentimes, babies and securely attached babies will eventually calm down and be able to keep playing with the toys in the room again, with the mother as the secure base. A securely attached baby is thought to develop from sensitive caregiving, where the caregiver consistently perceives what the baby needs, interprets their cues, and responds to them in a way that successfully mitigates their distress. All right, so the key is it's an effective intervention in the child's behavior. And the baby knows that consistently, my mom is sensitive to my needs. The next group are avoidant infants, which are insecurely attached, known as Group A. In these, in the strange situation during separation, the babies rarely cry. They're rarely not distressed that their moms leave, and they don't show much stress about that. Perhaps they're even still looking around the room. When the mother comes back, they avoid their mother. They either don't seek proximity to them or even ignore their mother altogether. This is thought to emerge from insensitive caregiving. And I use that phrase in quotes because I feel like it's a harsh word to use, but just the idea that maybe caregivers overstimulate their child or are intrusive, where maybe the baby's trying to sleep and they're consistently keeping them awake, or they're physically overwhelming them, or it's maybe the opposite of the caregiver is rejecting the baby and their needs.
Now let's look at resistant/ambivalent infants. These are Group C babies that are considered insecurely attached. In the pre-separation phase, when the parent is sitting in the room with the child, maybe playing, the child tends to show some signs of anxiety. Perhaps the child doesn't go and play with toys using the parent as a secure base. They may stay on the parent's lap. They may express distress from being in a new place. During the separation episode, when the parent leaves, this baby is intensely distressed, like super extra. In the reunion phase, infants are ambivalent about the mother. They seek close contact with her, yet they resist that contact at the same time. This is thought to emerge from, again, quote unquote, insensitive caregiving, like inconsistent care. So perhaps sometimes the caregiver responds to the baby's needs, and other times they do not. They completely miss the kid's cues. So this is thought to derive from mothers not always consistently giving care to their child. And then the last group that Ainsworth looked at were disorganized infants, Group D babies, who are also insecurely attached. This is characterized by very odd stereotyped behavior across the entire experiment. It might even reflect contradicting goals. Like in the return situation, perhaps the baby approaches and tries to escape from the caregiver at the exact same time. This is thought to emerge as a function of abuse or frightening or scary caregiver. This does not reflect most children in the study. Very few fit into this category, but it tends to deal with early childhood abuse. So those are our 4 types of babies in this attachment theory. We see that there are different types of temperament, and these express themselves differently, but is this continuous? This study in 1994 looked at temperament across generations. So they asked mothers and grandmothers about their attachment type, and then they ran the strange situation with infants. So what you can see is that those parents and grandmothers and mothers who were securely attached tended to have securely attached infants, and the same, The same was true for the avoidant group and the resistant group. As you can see, there's a little more variability in the insecurely attached babies than the securely attached, but this does provide evidence that perhaps the caregiver you had reflects the kind of caregiver you will be across generations. Now the big question, all right, we see that attachment predicts relationships. What else might it predict? Does it even predict outcomes? And Ainsworth, from her theory, developed the competence hypothesis, which is almost exactly what it sounds. Securely attached infants will be more competent than insecurely attached infants. So what she found was that compared to the anxiously attached infants, securely attached infants were more cooperative, less aggressive, more competent, and more sympathetic. They also had more positive interactions with peers across the board. And they tended to achieve better scores on developmental tests and measures of language development. So she concluded that these securely attached infants experience better outcomes across different significant life factors. Let's talk about attachment, maternal employment, and culture. All of this work led to the significant question: does maternal employment matter? As we saw with World War II, mothers were working during that time, and then many were fired or went home. And over time, women have begun to work more and more for various reasons. So many studies now have explored whether separating mothers and children for an extended period of time, particularly in the first 3 years of life, significantly affects their attachment relationship. The NICHD study of early childcare and youth development was the flagship study. It was from 0, or actually before children were born, to about 25 years old. And they measured attachment and everything they could think of with children, from physical health to peer relationships, and specifically looking at mothers' employment and childcare. So it was commissioned by the federal government to investigate this question: is maternal employment bad for kids? It's a multi-million-dollar study. It's a huge data set that still exists today. I wrote my master's thesis on this data set. What they found was that maternal time with infants was not related to attachment. So less time with your mother did not predict that you were insecurely attached, but it was maternal sensitivity that was positively related to attachment security. So more sensitive mothers were more likely to have secure children. In other words, they found that it's not quantity of time that mothers spend with their children, but it's the sensitivity they have to those child's need, the quality that really, really matters. They looked at childcare factors in this study and found that the quantity, the amount of time they spend in childcare, the quality of the childcare, the age they started childcare, and the stability of that childcare were unrelated to 15-month or 36-month attachment security. So a little over a year old and 3 years old. So in general, childcare does not appear to disrupt the mother-child attachment bond. What they did find was the combination of childcare factors seemed to predict some type of attachment insecurity. So if you have poor quality childcare, that doesn't significantly predict attachment, but with it in tandem with extensive care, so spending a lot of time in childcare, or low maternal sensitivity, or multiple arrangements, that's when it was related to greater insecurity. So the take home is there's very little evidence that maternal employment disrupts the critical mother-child attachment relationship. Is the strange situation culturally bound? We can recognize that a majority of psychology research, particularly that's popular in the Western side of the world, is done by Western psychologists, predominantly white, predominantly men, and predominantly Western contexts. And oftentimes we use these theories to decide if something like attachment is universal or culturally bound. Ainsworth, or not Ainsworth, but it just Durn, I won't try to say the names. This study looked at the different styles of attachment. They ran the strange situation across 5 different cultures. Notice that 4 of these 5 are still Western cultures, but they tried to look across cultures. And you can see A are the avoidant babies, B secure, C resistant. And there are clearly varying levels of avoidant and resistant / ambivalent babies across cultures, but it seems that a majority are secure, and most of the babies are secure in this across cultures. So there might be a universal piece. It fits with that normative hypothesis that most babies will be securely attached. So is cult attachment universal? Ainsworth ran her study in Uganda when she first ran it, but it was still developed by white psychologists from the Western Hemisphere. We know that caregivers play an essential role in children's lives across cultures, but genetics have a very small role to play in how attachment is developed. This isn't like temperament where it's very genetic. So there's this great article, Mesman from 2017, that talks about attachment across 5 different cultures that are not traditionally talked about in this literature, and I'd highly suggest that article if you're thinking about writing about attachment for your extra credit paper. This article concluded that there's a balance between universal trends in attachment and contextual determinants. For instance, in Western and non-Western cultures, most children communicate with several attachment figures like siblings. So it's not just one attachment figure in our lives. Universally, there are more. But at the same time, they also found that more work is needed on different attachment figures. Caregiver A versus caregiver B, which could be mothers versus grandmothers versus family friends who you're really close with. We also need to consider the socioeconomic context within these countries. And we need more cross-cultural studies of attachment. So in general, there seems to be a balance between universal trends in attachment and then the contextual determinants of how that attachment develops. So let's conclude. This lecture talked about how attachment develops in infancy and remains stable across early childhood, that the caregiver-child bond plays a role in child's future relationships, and that more work is needed to understand attachment across cultures. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great week. Remember, your test is next week. And stay safe, guys.